Hello everyone, I am your host, the Sea Monster, and welcome to part 2 of my essay video series on Shin Godzilla. Back in part 1, we went into how the story and character work turned out in the film, so now let's get into how the film does in the visual department, from cinematography to editing to special effects. So let's get right into it. So usually I jump right into the special effects, such as ones involving Godzilla, but I wanted to go over the editing first, as it's a pretty curious case in regards to this movie. The editing in Shin Godzilla is pretty strange, and I shall get into why that's the case. But first, a little bit of story time about how my first experience with the film was affected by a certain bit of editing. The first time I watched the film, there was such an abundance of subtitles intended to introduce us to the numerous characters and locations that it became very distracting. Granted, the only available version that I was able to watch at the time was the original Japanese version, and it was without English subtitles. I wasn't able to find any other version at the time, so I had to settle with this. But there was still so much text overlaid in some scenes, and so frequently, that it became a frustrating endeavor as it was constantly taking me out of the movie. Keeping people informed on who's who and what's going on is one thing. In fact, on-screen text has been considered to be rather useful as a way to provide context to the audience, so that they can know what's going on in the story as well as where they are in the story. But to constantly flood several scenes with text to where a viewer would have to rewind and pause in order to catch it all can be a major inconvenience for a good number of people, thus affecting their overall experience. In fact, having the film present all of its various characters with text is rather redundant when dialogue would have sufficed, or heck, even how certain characters like some military commanders and what they say and the jargon in which they speak can give us enough of an idea of who they are, at least in a general sense. As it is, though, the way the film introduced its characters via text, at least in the version that I saw in my first watch-through, was akin to Battle Los Angeles, where that film introduced us to its soldier characters whom we'd be following for its duration, with text on screen, laying out their biographies to us when simple dialogue exchanges would have been enough, and perhaps even more clever. Thankfully, though, when I watched Shin Godzilla for a second round, not only was it without subtitles as well as with very little text overlaid, but it was also dubbed, so I was able to get a less frustrating experience out of it at least. That being said, there is still certain strange decisions that were made when it comes to text overlays. Strange decisions that I've considered to be as such that have carried over from my first watch through into the second. A good example would be a scene where various characters discuss how to go about quelling Godzilla's initial attack despite him being technically considered as unarmed. It's very apparent that it's a list of articles intended to set up various guidelines for the Japanese government to follow/consider in order to properly make certain decisions. However, not only is there so much of it that it can be hard to follow for some viewers, but it's all in black text, and some of it is obscured by certain things in the scene which the text is placed in, such as parts of people's suits and ties. I understand that this is intended to try to help the viewer understand how these proceedings work, or heck, even sort of understand how crazy, complex, and convoluted all these guidelines are, but this text is still made totally redundant by the characters outright discussing the articles and legislations, what they are, and showcasing how these articles are preventing these people from being able to do anything about Godzilla's attack immediately. Also, if this black text is meant to be a tool for educational purposes, then why are parts of it overlaid over black clothing? Sure, the text has to go somewhere, but why not just limit the text to certain key points and have it placed strategically in spots or stylized in a way where it can be readable? Or better yet, why have these shots and the text there in the first place? Why not just set up a camera on some sheets of paper that these articles are written on and have the dialogue overlaid in the shots themselves? That way, there could be a sense that there are characters looking over pages upon pages of articles and legislations to try to figure out a certain course of action. This comes off as an attempt to add style to the film where it's not even necessary and where it's even jarring. But this isn't the only instance where the film adds some style that makes certain scenes come off as jarring. There are scenes like the one where Yaguchi and company are observing the coagulant formula, which would be used for the climax of the film later on a laptop. And this scene is shot from the POV of the laptop, while the formula is on screen and inverted. It's not a problematic moment in that it hurts the film in a significant way, but it's rather jarring, and it's pretty clear that the filmmakers wanted to present this scene in a more dynamic way than if it was just plainly shot. There's a sense of transparency in how they wanted the scene to be executed in a particular way without putting much thought into whether or not it would add much of anything to the scene itself. Again, not a huge deal or anything, just a bit curious, that's all. What it all boils down to in regards to the editing in Shin Godzilla is that it's all style over substance. Not much rhyme or reason, or even a strong sense of purpose going on with some of these stylistic choices that are done in the film here and there, but basically it's there to spice the film up when it's rather lacking in terms of proper substance such as story and characters. Anyway, enough about overlays and subtitles and style and all that. Let's get into other aspects in how the film is put together visually. So when it comes to how the visuals for the Godzilla segments are done, I will say that this is where I'm going to be lending some credit to the film. Let's get into those, shall we? For as much as I question and even criticize certain decisions made regarding how some of the human characters' scenes were shot, Godzilla's scenes are shot very well. There are several moments where the cinematography fully emphasizes the sheer size of Godzilla, and the way the CGI is used to depict him is done well enough where it's almost like he's actually there. And all those elements come together rather nicely in order to give us some visually splendid imagery. Even for a film where the CGI may seem to be a bit subpar in comparison to what we see in Hollywood these days, it's still rather impressive. Even as someone who doesn't personally care for Godzilla's design all that much, like really throughout this movie, I can say that there are even some shots in this film where he looks kinda scary. When Godzilla makes landfall in his most prominent form, there are several shots where he is shown at a distance, as well as even shots such as one from the perspective of a car driving by as he walks along. Swap Godzilla out with something like a tornado, and it could make for some of these shots to be pretty terrifying because of how almost realistically he is portrayed in this sequence. The scene depicting Godzilla's first firing of his atomic breath, aka the Who Will Know scene, is especially striking on a visual level. Having the scene take place at night while contrasting the darkness of Tokyo undergoing a blackout with Godzilla's scene of fiery carnage really lends to the ominous and almost apocalyptic tone of the sequence itself. Despite my complaining and moaning about some scenes involving human characters being done out of the principle of style over substance, I'll even say that there are certain scenes involving human characters talking to each other, such as between Yaguchi and Patterson, or even scenes involving a conference room full of people discussing on what to do next, are shot very well, where good landscaping and some fairly solid camera movement is actually at play. So overall, in regards to the technical side of things in Shin Godzilla, such as visuals and cinematography and editing and so on, I can conclude that the film's editing is jarring in parts to where style over substance seems to be a key factor in it all, but the cinematography and visual effects do lend well to the film's overall presentation, especially once we are treated to the grand spectacle of Godzilla doing his thing. So, despite some problems, the technical side of things is still perhaps one of the stronger aspects of Shin Godzilla. So, I think we've gone over all that needs to be said with regards to Shin Godzilla, so yeah, now it's time for us to bring this essay video series to a close. Alright, it's time for us to close the book on this whole thing that I've got going on here. Basically, I'll just do a quick rundown of what we've just covered, and then put a nice bow on this discussion with some final words. Shin Godzilla is a film that had potential to be a pretty strong entry in the greater Godzilla franchise, which is why I understand the praise and reverence that it's received over the years, even though I can't really say that it's all that warranted. The film is very well directed for the most part. On a technical aspect, all the sequences involving Godzilla are pretty well done. and are even fairly effective when it comes to providing some striking imagery that may even hit people right at home in terms of how reminiscent it may be of real-life disasters. Unfortunately, such potential is hampered by a plot that is way more focused on and is more interested in getting across a socio-political narrative than providing us with human characters who have any sort of nuance or depth. Even Godzilla himself, despite some moments that are both visually striking and effective on a visceral level, is still lacking as far as being a character is concerned, especially when compared to his predecessors. While Shin Godzilla is not a terrible film objectively, and I could never, by any stretch of the imagination, put it among the worst entries in the Godzilla franchise, it has too many shortcomings for me to really look back on it with much fondness, and it's to the point where I certainly can never consider it to be one of the best entries in the Godzilla franchise. There are aspects in the film that do work overall, and I can certainly say that the filmmakers' hearts were in the right place, but I can't say that the film is all that strong in terms of overall quality. Now, there are still many folks out there that really like Shin Godzilla, and to be fair, there are things in it that do make it at least a unique enough entry in the franchise to where I can commend certain parts in it. But it still just wasn't that good. And that pretty much is the long and short of it, though it's more long than short, granted. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching this 2-part essay video series on Shin Godzilla. This was certainly an interesting film to talk about in terms of how the film holds up. While it may be fun to sort of do a 20-minute rant on this film on a previous site/channel, I feel something like that may not be the most effective way or convincing way to scrutinize this thing. So an essay video series was in order, especially after having given this film a second viewing not too long before doing this. I'm sure this will be some of my more controversial pieces of content out there, so it will be pretty interesting to see how this series will hold up over time. I do not intend to hold my punches when it comes to my overall stance on whatever films I've covered in the past or intend to cover in the future, but I am open to have a civil and fair discussion all the same. Nonetheless, I do hope that those of you who have stuck with this series have found it to be worthwhile regardless of the topic at hand and my approach on it. And I hope that this series was worthwhile for anybody watching to check out my other content, both past and future. Once again, thank you all for watching, and until my next video or series of videos for that matter, I will see you all later.